book Twitter, then you might have noticed that there was a slight kerfuffle over the past few days about own voices reviewers on places like Goodreads or on their own platforms, and how they often need to battle whiteness and institutional racism as exhibited by the authors themselves, or dedicated fans of the authors, or even random other reviewers on sites like Goodreads who don't often wish to hear or are unreceptive to ideas of intersectional criticism. However, this is not a video about that. This is actually tangential because as this grew on Twitter, I read a series of tweets by Tasha Suri, who wrote Empire of Sand. I know a bunch of you have read it and have really liked it. I reviewed it myself on my Bookstagram, and I thought she made a couple of really good points, and I'm just going to read out her Twitter thread because it's really well articulated, and I don't think I can put it any better than she does. So she says, "A major reason so many historical romances are whitewashed is because the minute you bring people of color into your Regency world, you have to answer this question. How did your rich white hero make his money? Was it via the slave trade? Does his family own plantations? Is he an absentee slave owner? Did he make his fortune in the East India Company? No, he just invests in trade. If he invests in trade, he is at least complicit in British imperialism and colonial atrocities. Or maybe his family just, checks notes, secured their wealth via the Enclosure Act of 1773, which caused huge displacement of people and forced them to the cities. If he's a Scottish landowner or Scottish lord, well, Google the Highland clearances. Historical fiction is always fantasy of a kind, but the fantasy of a landed gentry who haven't made their wealth off of the degradation of the working class and people of color across the empire, who aren't complicit in violence, falls apart when you write people of color into that narrative. Like, whoops, we suddenly can't ignore the monstrous elephant in the room. Very hard to have lust and love and hope with that elephant over there. And look, I love historical romances. I love it intensely. I'm not saying bin it all. But I am saying historical fiction's whiteness exists not because of historical accuracy, but in staunch resistance of it. And contending with colonialism in historical fiction of any kind is never an easy task, but one I'd love to see even more writers wrestle with. Now, obviously, this is not an opinion that I am opposed to, like I have an entire video about accuracy in historical fiction. It wasn't really about colonialism or about race relations. When I made that video, I was really just talking about gender relations more than anything else. But what Tasha wrote really struck a chord with me because it reminded me of one of the more complicated novels that I've read, which is Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. Now, this is a novel that is possibly the most controversial of her works because it is one in which she is least bothered if you can see that she is writing social commentary rather than fluffy romances. I belong to a generation that took her really seriously and read her books as real literature. And to people like us, it is faintly unbelievable when people talk about how it's basically worthless romance, which is an attitude that a lot of people have till this date and was definitely more popular during the 19th century. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that her books weren't shocking enough, unlike, say, the Bronte sisters, who really did set society by the ear. But Mansfield Park, I feel, comes the closest in terms of controversy because it really is born out of her abolitionist views. But it's a complicated thing, and there is a lot of controversy even among Jane Austen scholars. So if you haven't read the novel, it's the story of a young woman called Fanny Price who is sent to live with her aunt and uncle when she's about 10 years old because her family are too poor and too numerous for her to live at home. This is apparently quite normal, But anyway, Fanny arrives at Mansfield Park and she is basically the poor relation, and she's treated as such by most of the household. Eventually, she grows up, there is a reckoning of morality and manners, and eventually she finds her handsome prince and settles down. Said prince being her cousin Edmund. Now, a lot of the hate that this novel gets, especially from me, is on account of Fanny Price. Fanny is that wet blanket who shows up at a party and then just sits at the back, stone cold sober, and only ever opens her mouth to criticize. She's that conscience that nobody ordered. There's this series called The Chalet School, and it's set in the school for young women, and there's a scene in it where the girls are having an English grammar lesson and the teacher says if you add OUS to a word in English, then it means it's full of that thing. So for example, anxious. If you add OUS to anxiety, then it becomes full of anxiety. And then one of the girls pipes up, and just to be interesting, she says, oh, does that mean pious means full of pie? And it's a lame joke, but I always think of it when I read Fanny Price, because it's literally the only way that I can make it through her sections. I just imagine her bursting to the seams with pie. The only good thing that Fanny has going for her is that she has the courage of her convictions, and even though she's a bit of a dormouse, the kind that nibbles your wainscoting, she does make her tiny little voice heard. And I do appreciate that about her. Like, she's not weak. She's annoying and judgmental, but she's not weak. Like, you can't even say that about Edmund, who is her fiancé at the end. I mean, he is a clergyman and he wants to be a clergyman. Why, I don't understand. And he's the most weak-headed idiot that I've ever read in my life. Anyway, Fanny and Edmund, match made in hell. Which is why I think Mansfield Park is not one of the more famous or more beloved Jane Austen novels, because it's really hard to root for the two of them. I don't think I've ever come across a person who says, oh, Fanny and Edmund, they're my favorite Austen pair. And now, of course, that I've said it, I'm sure a ton of you are going to descend in my comments and let me know. Fine, go at it. But if you're going to make that comment, I want to know why. Why do you think Fanny and Edmund are the best? I challenge you. So when you take that whole romance thing out of the novel, and to be fair, like, most of this novel is not even about Fanny and Edmund falling in love. It's about all the connections that take place between these people. And it's a pretty large cast of characters. And there are multiple threads that are woven in and out of it. And the one that excites a lot of interest, especially of late from feminist scholars and from post-colonial scholars, has been the theme of slavery. Like, a lot of novels that were written at a time when the authors just expected their audience to understand what was happening behind the scenes and what the context must have been sociopolitically at the time. Austen's novels don't always spell things out. And that's really a difference between somebody who's writing contemporary novels and somebody who's writing historical novels. So if you compare, say, Austen's novels to Georgette Heyer's novels, when she is writing about the Regency, she's always giving these little clues about what's happening in the larger world, which is why her characters usually sit around a table and discuss, the impact of the Corn Laws, for example, or demobbed militia officers. Whereas with Austen, it's just part of the fabric of the background. And in a way, this is what has contributed most to the controversy around her work, because Edward Said wrote this very influential post-colonial essay about Jane Austen and how she was complicit in colonial racism and attitudes towards slavery. which is of course something that a lot of Austen scholars have taken great issue with, because she was an avowed abolitionist and she expressed her admiration and her support for the abolitionists of her era, and it's extremely clear in her private correspondence that she was anti-slavery. But I think that sort of misses the point, and it sort of goes back to what Tasha Suri was saying in her Twitter thread, which is that as time has evolved and as we are beginning to hear more voices of color, of different experiences and sexualities and genders, we are beginning to see the value of the explicit call out. How a culture of politeness and polite disagreement, no matter how intense the feelings that inform that polite disagreement, ultimately helps the oppressor. And I know there's a lot of discussion about how the discourse is getting more shrill and about how people are getting more polarized, and I can understand all of that and I can see it, especially online. But I also think it is necessary at some level, because a lot of the noise and confusion that we are hearing arises from people objecting to these newer voices who are demanding a space in the discourse. So when we look at something like Mansfield Park, so the way it is written, there is a tension between the morality and what goes on in the big city, as is represented by this brother and sister duo who arrive in the vicinity of Mansfield Park, and basically they serve as a catalyst to several things that happen to the inhabitants of Mansfield Park. And Fanny Price is basically this proponent of the superiority of the rural life and of a more genteel, more tranquil existence, which again goes back to several themes that we will see in British literature about the purity of the countryside. And it is important to note that Sir Thomas, who is the father of Edmund and the owner of Mansfield Park and Fanny's uncle by marriage, and is the owner of the sugar plantations in the Caribbean that are worked via slavery, is definitely presented as the baddie. But the thing is, his evil is very easy to quantify and to recognize, even for people who are not from the 19th century. I mean, if you were familiar with abolitionist discourse back in the Regency era, then you obviously understood immediately what Sir Thomas was up to and how reprehensible he was. It didn't really need to be spelled out, even though Fanny has this one scene where she asks him about the plantation and it falls into this really uncomfortable silence. And that's a scene that sort of portrays her conviction and her courage in her convictions and her ability to create a scene if necessary in search of the greater good. But that's literally as explicit as the novel really gets, which is something that has been redressed in adaptations later on. So it's not just a moral evil, but it's a physical evil, and it sort of comes back to haunt the family. But in the novel, what happens, and I think this is what Said was really picking up on and what a lot of the people that take issue with his essay seem to miss, which is that by idealizing the life at Mansfield Park and its context in the English countryside, Austen kind of forgets that the life that Fanny idealizes is actually made possible through Sir Thomas's wealth. So while Sir Thomas is the baddie, and it's very easy to see why he's the baddie, in the original novel and in the later adaptations, whether on TV or in film, we don't really address the fact that Fanny's ideal life, that the ideal English life, is only made possible through the effects of British imperialism, which contributed to everything from slavery to indentured labor to rape and pillage. So if you're looking for a classic text, if you are looking for more Jane Austen recommendations, I'm going to recommend Mansfield Park, because I think of all of Austen's novels, it is the novel that speaks the most to this current moment. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.